after graduating from this School of Architecture, within School of Architecture and Allied Arts and Department of Architecture, Joe worked for ZGF Architects, a large architectural company in Portland, still a very large architectural company in Portland. Then Fisher Friedman in San Francisco, another high-profile company. And finally, he moved back to Mulvaney G2, as it's known, architects in the Seattle area. He did that partly to be near his mother, and it was while he was back there working with Mulvaney G2 that Joe sadly, probably as far as I can gather, as a result of something that he'd been carrying from birth, succumbed to pneumonia finally in his late 40s. As a result of that, two of the partners, Mitch Smith and Jerry Lee at Mulvaney G2, felt that something needed to be done to recall Joe as a person, as a designer. So they established in his name, then, after his death, the Joe Yamauchi Design Studio, which has been running in conjunction with this lecture series. The first three lectures have been really to do with the history of the Japanese internment in the Pacific Northwest. Tonight's lecture is going to be dealing with both the history, but how the future of that past and how to remember that at Minidoka. Joe's friendship with Jerry Lee, the partner, one of the senior partners at Mulvaney G2, actually goes right back to high school in Portland. They went to the same high school. They both studied architecture here simultaneously in the 70s, and ended up working together finally at Mulvaney G2 prior to Joe's premature death. So it's a mark of Joe's character that Jerry Lee and Mitch Smith felt sufficiently strongly that they established this fund in Joe's name. Joe, I didn't know at the time that there was a connection. Most Japanese Americans were connected in some direct or indirect way to the internment experience, but I didn't know it when we arranged this lecture series just how directly in Joe Yamauchi's case. So along with thousands of other Japanese Americans from Oregon, Joe's grandfather, parents, elder brother, and elder sister were all sent to, sorry, elder brother, but not, I've just been corrected, not elder sister, were all sent to Minidoka. And tonight's lecture will deal with the future of Minidoka War Relocation Camp, per se. Joe's father then, George Yamauchi, was one of thousands of young Japanese Americans who, from internment, actually volunteered to serve in the armed forces. And he was a member of the famous 442nd all-Japanese regimental combat team, still the most decorated unit for its size in American military history. So all Japanese who fought their way up through Italy into Nazi Germany. There's a long story connected to that. But Joe's father, then George, was a very articulate man as well as being a very brave man. And he describes vividly some of their experiences, his own experiences on coming back to the States and prior to departure. Then, that even though he was wounded, a wounded war hero, was still treated with prejudice on his return. So those issues were not just solved by the fact that they fought extraordinarily bravely for the freedoms of this country that were denied to them. So George Yamauchi won the Purple Heart. He was wounded in action in September of 1943, and it seems fitting then that this lecture series and the associated design studio has dealt with an issue that affected the Yamauchi family very directly. And we know from remaining evidence and from talking to the Yamauchi family then that Joe, we have a pretty good idea about Joe's opinion, personal opinion about internment, which meant a great deal to me personally to know for sure that this was not a non-issue for Joel, that through his father, I assume, who felt extraordinarily strongly and was very eloquent in articulating what they gave and the kind of bad treatment that they received in return in many cases. And I think that that must have been passed on, I'm sure, to most of the Yamauchi family. I'll talk about that a little in a moment, but one thing I did want to show was this is a photograph taken by Jerry Lee when they were both here as architects. Jerry came to the first lecture, and when this came up, says, "I took that photograph," you know, which I had no idea. This was sent by Joel's wife, Daphne. And these are photographs of the 442nd in Europe that Joel's father, George, fought in and was wounded in action fighting with. So in the last 2 or 3 weeks, I received a document from the Yamauchi family written by Joel's father, George Yamauchi, and it was all about the internment experience. And it's titled, rather ironically, "A Time to Remember." And clearly, towards the end of his life, George Yamauchi, then Joel's father, felt very strongly that he needed to pass this on, and he wrote it all down. And in amongst the extracts written by George Yamauchi, and there were various newspaper articles about members of the Yamauchi family, and Dale Minami, the famous lawyer, who was a first cousin of Joel Yamauchi, who was instrumental in one of the redress legal cases that overturned the prosecutions of Japanese Americans in the, I believe it was the early to mid 1980s. So this book also contained a series of interesting cartoons written or drawn by our own Joel Yamauchi. And without comment, I'd just like to show these, and then I'll proceed with the rest of the program. So this is the document itself was written by Joel's father, but the illustrations are by Joel. So I think we get an idea of how Joel might have felt about the subject of Japanese American internment. So here's the opening page, and it's dedicated to his to Mary, George's wife, who, as he said, went through it all. So here's Joel Yamauchi's take on the ridiculous nature of the sort of essentially racist foundation to internment. I'm not sure if you can read the answer to that was that as has been said many times, the machine guns, if they were there for their own protection, should have been pointing outwards and not inwards at these internment camps. And this addresses the redress, which was a highly controversial topic, a big debate over whether to accept money for something that money couldn't really repair. And this was Joel's final word on that if you died, of course, you got nothing, and nor did your descendants. So this is George Yamauchi, Mary Yamauchi, Terry Yamauchi, and Pam Yamauchi. This is shortly after they, three of them, the three elder Yamauchis, then were released from Minidoka internment camp. Pam was born shortly afterwards, and although sadly we don't have George Yamauchi or Mary Yamauchi with us anymore, we do actually have Terry and Pam. Pam was born, as I said, shortly after their release, but Terry is the one of Joel's siblings that did spend time at Minidoka, was interned with his parents. And I asked Terry, who's flown here basically from Arkansas. He's a leading doctor at the Arkansas Children's Hospital. He's flown here, taken time out from a visit to a conference to come down here all the way from well, I think he came from Portland, but via the Midwest and originally from Arkansas. So, Terry, if you'd like to say a few words about Joel, I think it might be appropriate. So, Terry Yamauchi, who's the toddler in the photograph you can see up there.
He got a little taller. Well, thank you, and thank you for coming tonight. Gosh, this is such an honor. You know, it's ironic that things like Minidoka happened. I'm going to read a couple paragraphs off a letter from my father that he wrote in 1943. But it is ironic. My grandfather, my father's father, was interned in Arkansas, and in fact, he was adamant that I should not go to Arkansas from UCLA, where I trained after I was at the University of Oregon Medical School. And he said he would never go back to that terrible place. But just in the past couple years, we had a very similar, very major program that people came from all over the world to attend, sponsored by the Rockefeller Foundation. To the tune of about $3 million, and it was a magnificent program. We had thousands of people that actually attended that, and I got to say a few words there. My experience in Arkansas has been nothing short of amazing, because I've been there 35 years now, and I became very closely connected with President Bill Clinton. I served as Bill Clinton's director of the Department of Human Services, and had a department of 9,000 people and a budget of $1.5 billion, which I spent. So I got in the right frame of mind, I guess, from that. But you know, this is really a wonderful honor for my little brother. There are 4 of us in the family. I carry the curse of being the eldest in an Asian family, which put a lot of pressure on me, but also was pretty nice in the family situation, since all the other children had to do what I said. And Joey was no different. He was, what a lot of you don't know is that Joey was born with something called congenital rubella. And the other part of the irony is my specialty is pediatric infectious diseases, and so I know quite a bit about that disease. And Joey had multiple congenital problems. One, he was very small. Joey was probably the most talented of our family. He got as far as art is concerned. He was an incredible artist. He took a lot of that from my mother, who was on the Pacific Northwest known for her egg work. She made designed eggs, and she did bouquet and flower arranging, and she was just terribly talented. I have two younger sisters, my Pamela, who carried me down here today, who was always the most popular one in our family, and Patty Jo, who's the baby of our family, who is again one of those real talented, intelligent, musically skilled individuals. She was better on the violin after 6 weeks than I was after 6 years, so I don't know if that tells how talented she was or something about myself. But Joey carried that burden with him. As talented as he was also a very skilled athlete. And he was just a little over 5 feet tall, but I remember in Little League, Joey pitched a no-hitter, and we were real proud of that. He was also one of the leading gymnasts in our state, winning a gym championship both at David Douglas High School in Portland at the state tournament and at the University of Oregon here on the gymnastic team. So we were always very, very proud of some of the things that Joey accomplished. I have a drawing that Joey did for me of a baseball scene in my office that is commented on all the time. I don't have very long. I'm going to say just a couple things because I know that Joey would be real proud of having this lecture series in his name and honor. We thank Jerry Lee and his group for being so generous in sponsoring a series like this. But really, to a large degree, a session like this is in honor also of my father, George. My dad was a real special person, and a lot of things that he looked forward to and expressed or didn't express were some of the same kinds of characteristic my brother had. And although my father was not terribly outspoken and vocal outside of his group, he certainly had strong feelings. He had wonderful ideas. He had ideas that are even today very pertinent. And I'd like to read just a couple comments or paragraphs from an article that Dad wrote for the Pasco Herald, where he was born and raised. And I will remind you of two things. One is that this article was written and published in the Pasco Herald in 1943. 1943. I want you to think about that when I read this, because this could have been written yesterday. Some of the things that he says in this article could have been expressed yesterday. And that's what makes this such a tremendously powerful editorial. And I would like you to think and substitute your town wherever I say Pasco, okay, because that's his home. It says here, and I'll quote this whole thing: "This is a soldier's plea for tolerance and the understanding of the problems facing the minority groups all over the world. This is an appeal for broad-mindedness and coolness in the midst of the worldwide war we are experiencing today. I was in Pasco recently on my furlough and was very much disappointed in the seemingly narrow-mindedness and narrow outside look on life that so many of its citizens have adopted since the war began." I want you to think about that, and you think about our situation today worldwide and the position the United States has worldwide today. The Pasco I left to go to college has changed vastly. Of course it has grown larger and more prosperous, but unfortunately these were not the only changes. The neighborhoodly attitude of the people has changed for that of distrust and suspicion. We in the Army are fighting for the four freedoms and the life as the Constitution of the United States has attempted to give us. We have no use for race baiting or internal squabbling of any kind. Too well we recall the system of Hitler used in the other countries. I can't recall the exact words, but the general idea in his Bible is to pit race against race, color against color, sect against sect, divide and conquer. Again, thinking about what is happening worldwide. I mean, this is a tremendous foresight that Dad was expressing. Let's be aware, yeast we of this country fall victim to the very same thing against which Americans are giving their lives. This is no time, and when there has This is no time, and when has there ever been time for majority groups to ride roughshod over the rights of minority groups? What is an American? Is he white, black, yellow, red, or any other color? It is generally conceded that he is any one of these or a mixture of them all. That is one of the principles of our Constitution, is it not? All of our parents came here for a common purpose, for religious freedom, for economic freedom, which they found and their children are willing to die to preserve it. Our armies fighting on all the fronts of the world, we find Negroes, whites, yellow men, red men, and all the rest fighting and dying for a common cause. All are united against under the banner they love. Yet no one is fighting for an American of one race or color. Let's all recognize that fact. So there has been much unfavorable publicity that it has been a tough uphill battle for the Japanese American to be recognized. Yet despite all sensational news headlines and broadcasts, there has never been a betrayal ever found among the Japanese Americans living in the United States or Hawaii. And Dad finishes by saying, my sister in Pasco, Washington, recently applied for a license to operate a small cafe. This is in 1943. Although my folks have resided there for 35 years, although she is a citizen, and although there are no legal rights to do so, still her application was denied on the grounds that she was a Japanese. The fact that she has 2 brothers in the Army, a third awaiting induction, quote, makes no difference to us. When a supposedly intelligent group of people come to such a decision, it is high time we look with alarm upon the future of this country. What are our soldiers really fighting for? The above is only one of a long list of the humiliations that my folks have had to suffer. There have been overzealous patriotic home guards peeking into windows at night. There have been telephone threats persecuting my father, and many more things making life very miserable at this time. I am writing to you, Mr. Williams, as a real American, as publisher of the lone publication. You can help immensely to get some of the people back to their senses, back along the road to Americanism as the founding fathers intended it to be. Yours sincerely, George K. Yamauchi. And when I read this, I thought, my God, Dad was, really saying, so Dad didn't want to talk too much about camp. I was too little to really remember too much about camp. Since we had the session there in Little Rock, Arkansas, and one of my longtime family friends in Arkansas has been, or was, Winthrop Paul Rockefeller, who was sponsoring this program. I became aware of some of the atrocities that were going on. To a large degree in Arkansas, the Japanese in camp were very well treated, and in fact were given many liberties, perhaps, that the average prisoner, as I can quote prisoner, would not have been given. But it is, and again, I reflect back on my dad's letter. So I'm just saying that I know that Joel would have been very proud of what is happening today, what has gone on this past in these past sessions that you've had, where he's had speakers, or you've had speakers talking to this subject. I know that if he were here, he would be sitting there applauding these statements and these concepts that my dad put forth in 1943. And really, I thank you for letting me have a chance to come here and represent my brother and my family on this very timely, important topic to us all.
Terry, that's good. Terry, thank you very much. I asked if Terry would read that letter when I first read that. I thought it was extraordinarily pertinent and powerful. Pam, Pam's pictured here, but you haven't seen her. Could you just stand up, Pam? And the other member of the Yamauchi family here, who've come a long way. I'm sorry, but these are important guests who've come a long way, so I'm sorry the introductions have kind of gone on a little, but I think it's appropriate. This is our last chance to acknowledge the Yamauchi family directly in this way. So to come on to our main speaker tonight is going to be introduced by someone who has a similar position. So Wendy Jansen of the National Park Service is superintendent at the Hagerman Fossil Beds and Minidoka National Historic Site. And her kind of, for want of a better word, opposite number in Portland is Mari Watanabe, who is executive director of the Oregon Oregon Nikkei Endowment, who have a presence at the Oregon Nikkei Legacy Center in downtown Portland. So it's their remit to tell the story, the Japanese-American experience in the Northwest, and obviously Minidoka and the internment is part of that story. So I'd like to ask Mari Watanabe to introduce our speaker, Wendy Jansen, please.
Good evening, and I'm very honored to be here and actually be able to meet Terry and Pam. The letter that Terry just read, it was very much you could just put in today. You know, you could have just taken out Japanese and inserted Arab or Muslim American in there, and there you would be right here in the year 2000. So I think one of the things that's really important is not just to think about this as something that happened in the past, but it's to remember what happened in the past, to learn from our mistakes. The government already said it was a mistake. I think we all agree it was a mistake to intern the Japanese because of their ethnicity. And so, but if we don't keep talking about this and telling people and educating, then people won't know, and people won't say, hey, we made that mistake already, let's not do it again. So thank you for sharing that letter. And to introduce Wendy Jansen. She is the superintendent of the National Park Service for the Minidoka National Historic Site, which is in Jerome, Idaho. But I asked her what's the closest biggest city, and that's Twin Falls, because to preserve that, she's helping to preserve this history and the culture about this and about the Japanese internment, because it is important to remember. So I'm very happy that she has taken this position. She has 20 years of experience that she brings to help the people, the Japanese Americans, really preserve this. There is a group called Friends of Minidoka, and I am actually on the board. And that's what we're working with Wendy to do. So building an Issei Memorial and acquiring land around it and doing other things such as building hopefully an interpretive center in the future. So we're honored to be able to do this and to honor our ancestors. So Wendy, she is a Rutgers graduate in political science. She lives in Buell, Idaho with her husband and large extended family. And she has been, as I said, 20 years in the Park Service working as a park planner, as the Chief of Interpretation and Education, and the Chief of Cultural Resources at diverse sites, such as the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area in the Los Angeles area, the Martin Luther King Jr. National Historic Site and Preservation District in Atlanta. And she also served as at the USS Arizona Memorial in Hawaii, and now she's in Minidoka. So I'd like you to welcome her, and I'm looking forward to hearing what she has to say. Thank you.
While we're waiting to switch programs, I just want to thank everyone for coming this evening. It's an honor for me to be here to share information about Minidoka National Historic Site with all of you. And I've had a chance before the program to meet some wonderful members of our audience, so thank you again for taking the time. And what I did initially, I'm going to go through the beginning of my program a little bit more quickly because of our time and cognizant of that, but also I know that many of you are familiar with the story of the internment camps. I did want to set it in historical context and reflect upon the past a little bit at Minidoka in particular, and then talk about what's been happening at the site since it was established and our future plans, but talk a little bit about the history as well. But I know many of you are very familiar with that. So I wanted to start off, and I believe, Kevin, you have the remote. Ah, here it is. Sorry about that. These are some images from Minidoka. As it was mentioned, it's in south central Idaho. It's the high desert and just north of the Great Basin. And I wanted to start off with this quote that I found in the Minidoka Interlude. It was the camp newspaper, and this was from the editor in 1943, and I think this is, once again, so relevant. We're going to hear that word over and over again because this story is as relevant today as it was back during World War II. We are proud that our government is of the people, by the people, and for the people. We are proud that our government is based on the principles of liberty and justice for all. It is our hope that our government will try to point out to her people the significance of the issues raised by our evacuation. And that's exactly the purpose of Minidoka National Historic Site and the National Park Service as an agency of the government, is to point out the significance of the site and once again make it very relevant for today's story. But to reflect on the past just a little bit, I won't once again spend a lot of time on this because you're very familiar with the story, but it goes back to the Executive Order 9066 signed by President Roosevelt back in February of 1942. And the War Department established areas from which any and all persons could be excluded. Military Area Number 1 is how the first area was called, and that encompassed the western half of Washington, Oregon, California, and the southern half of Arizona. And Military Area Number 2 included the remainder of the entire state of California. So this is where it all started. And the first individuals to be removed from their homes forcibly were those living on Bainbridge Island in Seattle. This happened on March 30th. And 227 residents of Bainbridge, two-thirds of them as well as two-thirds of the internees in general, were American citizens. And they were taken to the Eagledale Ferry Landing under armed guard. Not told where they were going. They were ferried to Seattle. They were put on trains with the blinds down, and they ended up at Owens Valley Reception Center, which eventually became Manzanar Internment Camp. And they were allowed to take one bag and what they could wear. They were only given 6 days' notice to hastily sell, store, or make arrangements for all of their possessions, their businesses, and their property. And they were the first on Bainbridge Island of more than 120,000 Nikkei to be forcibly removed from their homes. And just once again, I tried to have the voices of those who were interned speak for the story. And this is a quote about evacuation. As we boarded the bus, bags on both sides, I had never packed 2 bags before on a vacation lasting forever. The Seattle Times photographer said, "Smile." So obediently I smiled. And the caption the next day read, "Note smiling faces, a lesson to Japan." And this is the times that those folks lived in the 1940s. And you can see the generations who were sent to the internment camps. More images of evacuation from Bainbridge Island. And the evacuees were taken first to assembly centers, what were called assembly centers, before they were sent to the internment camps. Just some more images being boarded on buses. Very famous image of the evacuation sale sign. Once again, very little time to make arrangements for their property, for their homes. And this is where they were sent to. And I have my nifty. You can see the red triangles. These are the 10 internment camps, relocation centers called back then. But there were many sites, as many of you know, that individuals were taken to. Sites run by the Justice Department, the Army, what were called assembly centers, and they were throughout the country, not just on the West Coast, but in the East as well, in the Midwest. And you can see this line here was the evacuation area, as well as Alaska. These are individuals who were assembled at Puyallup in Washington. The camp was under construction for 2 months when on August 10th, 1942, 212 Nikkei from Puyallup arrived at Minidoka. And just about a week later, on August 16th, internees arrived at a rate of 500 per day from Puyallup and then from Portland to Minidoka. And this is an image of Minidoka under construction. During its peak population in 1942, there were 9,500 individuals at Minidoka, and at that time during the war from 1942 to 1945, it was the 7th largest city in Idaho at the time. When internees arrived, the camp was about 75% complete. And Minidoka housed individuals from Washington, Oregon, California, and Alaska. And so this is what folks saw when they arrived at the camp, and I thought this quote was very telling. Work was several times abandoned when dust storms brought about utter darkness. I've never been out at the site when there was utter darkness, but I can tell you, and those who lived that experience, it is not a pleasant place to be. The wind is always howling, the dust is always blowing, and these are some images of the camp under construction once again. The style and building construction techniques were based on a traditional military, quote-unquote, theater of operations design. It was intended for speedy construction and short duration. And when I talk about the future of Minidoka, that is going to be an issue, a challenge for the National Park Service, because these buildings were not meant to last. And how do we preserve those remnants of that internment experience to be able to educate the public? The internees were housed in buildings that were simple timber frame buildings built on concrete piers with tar paper walls. And Kevin has shown this picture in other lectures and discussions, but this is really quite astonishing to see this aerial photograph of the camp. This is the canal, which is still there today, running along one border. This is the entrance area to the camp, and you see the vastness of the structure, or excuse me, the camp. In total, there were 33,000 acres, and you can see the residential area here and over here as well. And this was the inner core of the camp, the administrative area, the hospital complex, the military police barracks. And then a lot of agricultural land, which is not in this photo. As I mentioned, the guard tower and the military police building and the reception area. That was the core area. There was also a sewage treatment plant, a warehouse area, and as I mentioned, the hospital. This really was a city unto itself and required all that a city needed to function and to operate. These are just some other images of life in the camp. A returning veteran coming to visit his parents inside a barrack building, the barracks themselves, one of the open areas in the residential complex with the flagpole, and the entry area also. The barracks were small. They were only about 20 by 120 and divided into 6 rooms of varying sizes. And each room housed one family unit or 4 to 6 individuals. There was a single dangling light bulb in the center of the room and a potbelly stove. And once again, as you can imagine, coming from lush and wonderful places in the Northwest, such as Oregon and Washington, coming to the stark landscape of Minidoka, the high desert with sagebrush, it was just very startling and disturbing, as one can imagine. In Life in Camp, this is a wonderful image. We're thankful to have a series of paintings from a former internee of Minidoka, Kenjiro Nomura, and this is from a painting, Life in Camp from 1943. Once again, another wonderful quote from an internee. Getting to the bath is a job because our shoes get stuck in the swampy mud. When the ground is frozen, it's fine until the sun comes out. When it snows or rains, we have to swim through the mud to get anywhere. And you can see a little bit of that. These are not pleasant conditions. Some more images of life in the camp. Between 1942 and 1945, the internment and incarceration affected immeasurable change within the social structure of the Nikkei community. Events and movements during this period dramatically altered the social environment and dynamics within the camp. I won't go into detail about these, but many of you are familiar with various events that affected the community, such as the loyalty questionnaire, Tule Lake segregation, the call for military service, agricultural labor projects, the indefinite leave program, as well as constant social unrest. And of course, looking at these wonderful photographs of individuals, you wouldn't be able to tell that, but this was the reality that folks had inside the camps. Once again, images, because life did continue, and the internees tried to have as much a normal life as possible under these excruciating and very difficult circumstances. So these are images from life in camp. I love the little children eating what looked like hot dogs, enjoying themselves. Recreation areas were developed, baseball fields, basketball courts. There was the camp newspaper, which was published. Students went to school. There was a yearbook. So life did continue on, as difficult as it was. And these are some examples of the wonderful gardens that internees developed outside the barrack buildings also. As I said, this was a city, the 7th largest in Idaho at the time. So who ran the city? Well, the internees did themselves. Roughly 10,000 people in the camp. That was the high end of the camp population. Unskilled laborers were paid $12 a month. Skilled laborers, such as carpenters and nurses, were paid $16 a month. And professional employees, such as the doctor shown in this picture, were paid $19 a month. And these images show a stark contrast to the wages paid by the local workers who were constructing the camp. They were paid $72 to $300 per week. So quite a discrepancy in those wages. And as a result, many internees had financial obligations that they could not keep from their home. And these wages were inadequate to pay for mortgages, to pay for outstanding debts, and to keep their businesses going. So as a result, many internees unfortunately lost their homes, their farms, and their businesses. And just some more images of life at the camp, another building under construction, and agricultural work. This was a self-sustaining community and population. During the war, you can imagine they needed to raise their own food. There were hogs that were raised, sugar beets, other crops that were grown. A cannery and a pickling plant were also constructed at the camp. And just another image from Mr. Nomura of life at the camp. And of course, during this time, we had World War II going on, and internees served in the war. And once again, I'm honored to be here in the presence of the family and talk a little bit about the 442nd, which was such an important part of the history of World War II. In 1943, President Roosevelt established an all-Nisei unit, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and called for volunteers from the internment camps. And the Nisei at Minidoka distinguished themselves tremendously, and eventually 1,000 names were listed on Minidoka's honor roll as having served in the military. This is an early photo. Actually, later photos show 2 side panels because of all the names that needed to be added to the honor roll. And this is a project that we're working on with the Friends of Minidoka to recreate this honor roll and place it out at the camp once again. And also we had, besides the 442nd, residents also served in the Military Intelligence Service as well as the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps. Minidoka had less than 7% of the male population of all the centers, yet it provided 25% of the volunteers. And at the end of World War II, the 442nd was known for its slogan, which was called "Go for Broke." As has been mentioned this evening, they became the most decorated unit in American military history for its size and length of service. And now just to jump forward a little bit, we're back to the end of the war and the closure of the camps and what happened. And on December 20th, 1944, the War Relocation Authority officially lifted the ban on persons of Japanese ancestry in military areas 1 and 2 that I mentioned earlier. So basically the entire West Coast was once again opened up for what was called resettlement at the time. During the late summer of 1945, despite the uncertainties of conditions on the West Coast, individuals just didn't know what they were going to go back to, if they had anything to go back to at all. People wanted to get out of the camps as quickly as possible. So Minidoka began to empty, and people began to return to their homes or begin to build their lives anew. By September of 1945, there were empty barracks in every block. People had left behind possessions that they could not carry with them, miscellaneous goods. And the War Relocation Authority provided $25 per person, train fare, and meals en route for those individuals at the camps who had less than $500 in cash. And the last remaining internees were forcibly removed from the camp and put on trains to Seattle in October 1945. And the camp itself officially closed on October 28th. And we've been told by former internees, some who stayed behind, that they lingered because of, once again, that uncertainty. They didn't have a place to go home to, didn't have a home to go home to. So this is why they stayed at the camps as long as they did. And once again, some images from life in the camp, and then what happened afterwards, the Day of Remembrance. That was established to honor those who were interned. For the Nikkei community, the wartime incarceration was the defining event in the community's history. The incarceration damaged the dignity and identity of the Nikkei community and generated divisive rifts between generations, community organizations, and individuals over issues of patriotism and loyalty. And for the planning of Minidoka National Historic Site, we've heard that over and over again from former internees, from scholars and historians. People had to rebuild their lives after the war, and the experience of injustice and racism at the hands of the federal government and also the American public created a stigma of shame that prevented most former internees from discussing their experiences for decades. There was silence for decades. And then I want to jump to the National Park Service. What was happening during those decades of silence by the former internees? Well, the Park Service itself was continuing to grow and evolve as an agency. And this is a quote from historian James Lowen. He mentioned, "Americans like to remember only the positive things, that communities like to publicize the great things that happened in them." And that's an evolution that we've seen not only in the Park Service, but in academia and society as well. We've only wanted to look at the glorious past, and that's reflected in some of our National Park Service sites, Independence Hall in Philadelphia, the Statue of Liberty, and battlefields such as Shiloh from the Civil War. Most people associate the Park Service with scenic sites such as Grand Canyon and Yellowstone, but we have a long history of preserving sites of national significance, national historic significance. But the focus has not always been on those untold or uncomfortable stories. In the past, the Park Service's national quilt of sites did not cover all. And that began to change in the 1970s. Historian Michael Wallace, a wonderful quote about Americans having an impatience with the past. They assume that the past can be endlessly evaded. And we've tried to address that in the National Park Service, beginning in the 1970s with various movements from the environmental movement to the women's rights movement to the civil rights movement. The Park Service began to commemorate aspects of what historians called the new history. No longer would national historic sites be established solely to commemorate former presidents or battles. I sometimes wickedly refer to them as dead white men sites, but we've begun to evolve over time, and new sites were established in the 70s and 80s, which continued into the 90s. Sites such as Martin Luther King Jr. National Historic Site, one of the sites that I worked at. More recently, Central High School in Arkansas in Little Rock, which talks about the civil rights movement and the Little Rock Nine and integration. And most recently, a site I worked on as a park planner, the Selma Montgomery National Historic Trail in Alabama, which talks about the Voting Rights Act and the walk from Selma to Montgomery for civil rights and civil liberties. We've added women's history sites that historian Robin Winks from Yale called Sites of Shame. We have sites that talk about Native American history and Washita Battlefield, which was a massacre by the U.S. Army of Native Americans, Sand Creek Massacre. So we've taken more of these sites as our society has grown and evolved, as we've become more diverse, and previously underrepresented groups have had more political power and authority, and their voices have been heard more. The Park Service has met that change and that challenge and added these sites as well. And that has led to the establishment of Minidoka. To jump back, before the park was established as a National Park Service site, preservation efforts had begun well before that. In 1979, 6 acres at the entrance area, which is what we see here, were listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And that includes the remains of the military police building, the reception area. And just across the street, I'll show that in another slide, is the historic rock garden built by the internees themselves. And then in 1990, in May, the state of Idaho named Minidoka an Idaho Centennial Landmark. And then the Park Service came into the picture in 2001. President Bill Clinton signed a presidential proclamation establishing Minidoka Internment National Monument, as it was called originally, as the 385th unit of the National Park System. And that included just a little over 72 acres of the original 33,000 acre site. And then just last May, in 2008, Congress passed Public Law 110-229, which expanded the boundary of the park to include totaling 300 acres, including 8 acres at Bainbridge Island in Seattle, for the Nidoto Nayani Let It Not Happen Again Memorial. This is a wonderful picture from the cover of our general management plan, which was finalized in November of 2006. And this quote is from the presidential proclamation signed by President Clinton, that Minidoka was established as a unique and irreplaceable historical resource, which protects historic structures and objects that provide opportunities for public education and interpretation of an important chapter in American history, the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. And a lot of folks wonder, what happens after you establish a national park? We have a presidential proclamation. We then have additional legislation from Congress. And one of the first things that we do in the National Park Service is we plan. We plan for the future. And our general management plan is really another term for a strategic plan. It's a 15 to 20-year vision for the park. And we don't do that alone. We're not islands unto ourselves. We bring in all of our partners, like the Friends of Minidoka, former internees, members of the community. And a series of public meetings were held in Idaho, in California, Washington, Oregon, and Alaska, getting opinions from the public, those who were former internees and just interested individuals. What would you like to see? What does this site mean to you? How do you want this piece of American history, which is all of our history, interpreted in the future? So we develop in our strategic plan the purpose of the park, the significance, the interpretive themes, and the desired future conditions, once again, what we want to see in the future for that site. And I also need to mention that when sites are established by Congress or by presidential proclamation, one of the challenges and opportunities for us in the Park Service is we don't often have a budget that goes along with that. My former park in California, Santa Monica Mountains, when it was established in 1978, there was no budget that accompanied that. So that's part of our process as we develop sites and get them up and running and be able to provide visitor services, is to be able to have that budget to do that, to hire staff, to provide for development, and have facilities available for the visiting public. So I mentioned we had public scoping and planning workshops. This was before my time. I've only been at the park for 8 months now. But from the results of those workshops, and this is noted in our general management plan, the themes, the focus that the public wanted to see were focusing on civil and constitutional rights, the people involved, not just the internees, but those who worked for the government, for the War Relocation Authority, the local community, the place itself. The cultural landscape is so important at Minidoka because it really still looks as it might have back during the 1940s. You get that sense of that stark landscape, those harsh conditions, and that's very important for us to preserve and protect. And then also placing it in context within World War II itself. And one of the public comments, so simple yet it's so important, is that I want every school child and every adult to know about the camps. And when we look at planning, we look at various park operations. We examine cultural resources, natural resources, interpretation and education, facilities, partnerships, outreach. All of that is contained in our general management plan. And I have a copy in my bag. It's a little over 200 pages, so it's a hefty document, but it's that great guiding planning tool for us. Just a little bit about the park itself, if you're not familiar with the site. If you remember some of those historic photographs I showed earlier, this is the entrance, the historic entrance to the camp. And here's the canal that runs as a natural boundary. And in the planning process, there were 4 management zones that were developed for the camp. The canal zone, which is in yellow. The pinkish area is cultural resource is a historic features zone. And these are areas where we have remnants of existing original structures that you can still see the camp on the landscape. The green area is also another cultural resources zone, but that's a historic open space zone, and it was traditionally and historically. And then there are a few areas designated for development at the park. This area is a site where we have an existing warehouse building, a portion of it, and that's noted for the park's visitor center in the future. And also this area over here, which was not part of the original camp, but is part of the park, and that's where we're working with the Friends of Minidoka to develop an Issei memorial. This is another map from the general management plan. I won't go into too much detail, but I've talked a little bit about this. The entrance area, the historic garden, this is where the honor roll was located. So we're working with our partners to establish that, put that back on the landscape. I've shown pictures of the remnants of the original buildings that are at the entrance area. There's a call for reconstructing a guard tower, which would have been there historically. This area here is called the Herman Homestead. This is part of the story that we tell about life after the camp, after the internees left, and this became land used by the local community and homesteaded. And we actually have original structures in this area as well. The fire station from the camp is still there. And that is now, with the legislation in 2008, part of the park boundary. That land is owned by one of our partners right now, the trust or the conservation fund, and we have money this year to purchase that from them. So that will be officially part of Minidoka National Historic Site. Some other areas here that I'll talk a little bit about in a second is Barrack Block 22. That was called for in the general management plan to be reestablished so that we can interpret that important piece of the camp story for the visiting public. The warehouse, where our visitor center will be located in the future, and this is a core historic area as well as a development area. This is the canals I mentioned earlier, the perimeter fence, and part of that barbed wire fence would be reconstructed to give that sense of leaving freedom and entering confinement. And over here in the development zone is where the Issei Memorial will be constructed. I wanted to jump to talk a little bit about cultural resources. And it's hard when you talk about how parks are managed and how we operate the national park system. We have different titles, we have different divisions: cultural resources, natural resources, interpretation, education, facilities, but they're so intertwined you really can't talk about one without talking about the other. So when I talk about various cultural resources at the site, there's always going to be an interpretation, education component, a facilities and maintenance component, because the story is just so intertwined in how we manage those resources. But in the Park Service, we have different cultural resources that we are required to preserve and protect. And these are just some examples of cultural resources at Minidoka. We recently, thanks to our friends in the Seattle area, had donations of original furniture that was constructed at the camp that has been donated to the park that will eventually be on display on exhibit. Some archival items that are in our park museum collection right now. And we've done various archaeological surveys at the site. This is of the entrance area, the garden, that was constructed by internees. This area here is the entrance garden as well. And you can see the delineation right here of the honor roll, where that was and where that will be. And the flagpole will be reconstructed as well behind that. But that is intact. And then also, with the legislation last May when the park boundary was expanded, we went north and added 80 acres of land that was originally owned by the Bureau of Land Management, and that was the site of the historic landfill for the camp. So we've done archaeological surveys there as well. And our role with cultural resource management is really, once again, the stewardship, the protection, and the preservation of those historic elements, such as the landscape features, the structures, the remnants of that history that we want to preserve and interpret. And there's still much more to do. We need to do historic structures reports for the barrack buildings to understand the buildings that we've identified to move back to the camp or that are there already, what elements are historic, how they have been modified, how we want to preserve those and interpret those in the future. And these are some renditions from the general management plan. of what the entrance to the park might look like in the future. Reconstructing the guard tower, the building remains, the stone remains that are still there today, the entrance and garden area, putting the honor roll back on site. To give you a sense of, once again, this came through in the public meetings, that sense of internees moving from confinement, from freedom to confinement, and actually rebuilding part of the original barbed wire fence and having that as part of what we interpret at the camp. This is an artist rendition of Block 22. Once again, very important for the Park Service to reestablish Block 22. This past year we had a graduate student from Boise State University doing research for us, and he's identified 20 buildings in the community that are in various shapes of preservation or decay. They are original barrack buildings. We've also located 2 original mess hall buildings from the camp. And those owners are willing to donate or sell those to the National Park Service to what I call repatriate them to the site and begin to establish Block 22. These were the barrack buildings on either side, the recreation and mess hall, and then this H-style building was the lavatory and laundry facility. And we do have the land for Block 22 that we'll be purchasing this year. And the barracks block is going to provide a variety of visitor experiences. In the general management plan, it's called for having one building potentially look as it did when the internees first arrived at the camp. Just have the bearer bulb hanging down from the ceiling, have the potbelly stove, and the Army issue cots. Then visitors could move into the second barrack building and see what it might have looked like after the internees had unpacked, begun to make their own furniture, order items from the Sears Roebuck catalog, for example, and really make it feel like home as best that they could and interpret that. And then have some buildings where we have exhibits that talk about the internee experience. And it's very important for the Park Service to use the words and images of those who experienced that time. We have a wonderful partnership with Densho, an organization based in Seattle, and they've done oral history interviews with Minidoka internees as well as those from Manzanar. And that's rich material that we would use to interpret the site, because of course no one can say it better than those who went through that experience. These are some of the buildings that are still on site. What happened after the camp closed is that the land was made available to returning veterans, to the local community, to homestead. Some buildings were left in place depending upon the family that took over that piece of property. Others were moved out into the community, and these are still on site. Once again, it's not a full barrack building. They were chopped up, half of a building, a third of a building. But these are buildings that we'll be working with our preservation specialists in the Park Service to determine what is original material, what's been modified, and how best to preserve those and interpret those for the public. And I mentioned the fire station earlier. This is the original fire station. It's in its exact location and has not been altered. It still has the original timber frames and wood siding. And that's a historic photograph of the fire station. And of course, intertwined with the preservation of cultural resources is their interpretation and education. And these are scenes from the pilgrimage event, the annual event that takes place at the end of June. It's coming up in a few weeks, where former internees and their families and interested individuals and members of the community come together to honor that history, honor those who were interned, and remember that story. And this is also part of the original root cellar in this picture as well, and portions of the rock garden that you can see here. And what the Park Service does with interpretation is provide the public with an opportunity to examine the profound injustice, the hardship, the upheaval, the sacrifice, and the uncertainty that were integral parts of the internment experience. And it's our responsibility, our duty to represent those accurately through the words of those who survived and who lived that experience. And this is a building I mentioned earlier. This is an original warehouse. It's not the full size. It's just a half of an original warehouse building. But this is identified in our general management plan as the future visitor center. As you can see, it needs a little tender, loving care. Some so to speak. This is siding that was placed on the building after the camp closed. It was used by the Bureau of Reclamation, which originally owned this property. That's really to our benefit because original historic fabric is behind that metal sheeting that has preserved the building. So part of our planning for the park is to bring interpretive planners together, partners and staff, and determine what types of exhibits we want to have in the visitor center, what visitor experience we will have for orientation and information, and then move visitors out into the rest of the site. And I apologize, these are not very good images, but they give you a sense of what we are working on at the park. These panels right here are what we call wayside exhibit panels in the Park Service, outdoor exhibits. We actually have finished those for Minidoka, and they have arrived at the park and will be installed before the pilgrimage this year. And this allows visitors to travel through the site along the historic trails and learn about the site and experience it on their own through self-discovery. And then some other potential uses for the barrack area where we do not have enough buildings to repatriate is we can delineate those so visitors get a sense of the size of the camp itself and all of those structures. There are different methods that we can use depending upon what resources are available as far as historic structures and what the site is going to be interpreting. And of course, I've mentioned this several times, the people of Minidoka. We would not be able to tell our story if we did not have the former internees who are willing to share their stories with us through oral histories, working with our partner Densho, and by coming to the pilgrimage. These are scenes from a recent pilgrimage. And that really is so important to us. We take that responsibility very, very seriously to be able to interpret this story and educate the public. And one of the tenets of interpretation in the Park Service is the relevance issue. And we've mentioned that a couple times today, is making this story, because it is so relevant today as it was back in the 1940s, and providing visitors information about those tangible resources, the structures, but the intangible, those feelings of confinement, those feelings of being uprooted from your homes, taken to a place that was foreign and strange, and those feelings of discrimination and racism, and providing that information to the visitor and having them come to their own conclusions and to learn about the story. And that's really our main purpose here. And just quickly, this is the site identified for Barrack Block 22. It's farmland right now, but we will be purchasing that this year. It's in trust for us by the Conservation Fund. And you can see this site from the warehouse building. And we have some other exciting acquisitions on the horizon. This map shows the historic boundary of the camp, of the residential area, to give you a sense of the size. And the agriculture area was surrounding it, 33,000 acres total. The green area is existing National Park Service land. As I mentioned, the historic core, the entrance area. The Herman property is also called the Farm in the Day property because it was constructed basically in a day in the early 1950s by the community. That is where Block 22 is located. That will be reestablished. And then a recent acquisition for us is this property here called the Subject property. It's about 100 acres. It's called the Robeson property, and it was not in the original plan for the park because there was an absentee landowner. But the Robesons have lived at the property since the end of World War II. And the son is a doctor in Wyoming and decided to sell and came to the Park Service. We did not have the funds this year, so our friends at the Conservation Fund stepped in and purchased this property for us. It's very significant historically because not only were there barrack buildings there, but the police compound and the hospital compound was at the site. And this is how it looks today, and it's at the entrance to the park. Another important project for us on the horizon is working with the Friends of Minidoka to develop a memorial to the Issei. And if you remember the map I showed earlier, it's on the eastern end of the park, once you've gone through the historic core area. And these are initial concept designs that the Friends of Minidoka have been working on for this project, and we're making, this project is now making its way through the National Park Service approval process. And you may remember the picture of the parasol-like structure. That's from our general management plan. And we have a similar structure here for the memorial. And the concept is there will be parking here in a trail with stone lanterns, poetry markers, the shelter with the parasol structure, as well as memorial walls with the names of the Issei who were interned at Minidoka. And I want to mention also Bainbridge Island. A lot of folks don't know that this is now part of the park, as I mentioned with the legislation last May. 8 acres of the memorial were added to Minidoka National Historic Site. The Park Service does not own this land. It's owned by the city of Bainbridge Island, but we'll be cooperatively managing this site with our partners, the Japanese American Memorial Committee, the city of Bainbridge Island, their Historical Society, and Park and Recreation Department. And the site has been preserved for many years, and construction has been taking place for various aspects of the memorial for many years as well, long before it became part of Minidoka National Historic Site. And it's being designed by John Paul Jones, who most recently designed the National Museum of the American Indian. And as I mentioned earlier, this is where the first Nikkei were taken from their homes back in 1942. And what's on the ground right now, the phase 1 that has been completed, are memorial pavilion, entry and exit gates, a walkway across a wetland area. And it's just a beautiful site. I was there for the first time last February. Phase 2, which broke ground this past March, is for a story wall, which will be developed and leading out to a reconstructed dock, the Eagledale Ferry dock that took the Bainbridge Islanders to Seattle. And we are providing interpretive assistance with the National Park Service for the content of those panels on the story wall. The wall itself should be finished this fall, and then we'll be working to have the panels constructed and installed. And phases 3 and 4, this is from a model by Jones & Jones of reconstructing the historic dock and providing visitor services and facilities at Bainbridge Island. This is once again a very important story for us to be able to tell the beginning of internment and evacuation and what happened after the camps closed. And that's an important story for us. Lives were disrupted, and what did people have to go back to? How did they rebuild their lives? And also the importance of the community thriving. As I've worked with various groups, African American groups, Native American groups, the various parks in my career, it's always been important for folks to say, you know, we're still here, we're still thriving, you know, especially with tribal members I've worked with. They don't want to always show the historic photographs. They want people to know that they're living, breathing, in a very active and involved community. And that's part of our responsibility with Minidoka as well, is what happened after people left the camps. How did the community survive and thrive into the future? And I will start to close by just also talking about quickly challenges. Every park has them. We have many wonderful things that we have planned for Minidoka that have taken place. I've mentioned our annual pilgrimage, which is coming up at the end of June. Accompanying that, we have an annual Civil Liberties Symposium. It's in its 4th year, and it's a partnership with the Friends of Minidoka and the College of Southern Idaho. And we have our wayside exhibits that are going in. We have teacher curriculum that we've developed with Densho that will be unveiled during the Civil Liberties Symposium. So much has happened, much is planned for the future, such as getting the visitor center developed and Block 22 as well. But as with every park, we have our challenges and our threats. And the National Trust for Historic Preservation had Minidoka on its list in 2007 of the 11 most endangered historic sites in the country. And most recently on their website, they provided this update and quote about Minidoka, is that it's a place with a hard past, and for the past few years, a challenging present as well. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but these are 2 issues that I spend a lot of time working on, as well as our partners. On the left, these are cows. I call them unhappy cows. This is what we call a CAFO, a confined animal feeding operation. It's basically an industrial dairy. And there's the threat of a CAFO about 1.5 miles from Minidoka. And our partners, the National Trust, Friends of Minidoka, the Japanese American Citizens League, and Idaho Preservation Trust, just to name a few, are actually working to fight that CAFO actively and have filed a lawsuit. And likewise, we're working with our solicitor's office to determine what actions we can take to prevent that. That would be a tragedy to have that so close to Minidoka National Historic Site and impact our cultural landscape and the visitor experience. And a new challenge is transmission lines. I didn't have a good picture of those, so I took an image from a report I was reading recently. We also have the threat of a power company that wants to run transmission lines through Minidoka, and we're working with our solicitor's office to challenge that as well. So there's so much that's bright and hopeful, and we're so excited about Minidoka. But as with every park, we have pressures on our boundary and external threats that we are addressing so that we can continue to preserve and protect this most important national site. And that brings me to my closing slide. And just a reminder, and this is always a wonderful quote for me as a National Park Service employee, sometimes I feel I get stuck in my office a little bit more than I would like to. And I read quotes like this, and I'm newly inspired. James Bryce was the British ambassador to the United States around 1900. And this was even before the National Park Service was established as an agency in 1916. But he was talking about the importance of national parks. And he said, "We are the trustees for the future. We are not here for ourselves alone. All these gifts were not given to us to be used by one generation or with the thought of one generation only before our minds. We are the heirs of those who have gone before and charged with the duty we owe to those who come after." As James Bryce remarked, Park Service or national parks are a commitment by one generation to future generations for our children and our grandchildren. And that's in our mission statement. And that's everything we live and breathe in the Park Service is about that stewardship, about that legacy, and preserving and protecting those sites. And our collection of national parks today, from Minidoka to the USS Arizona Memorial to Yosemite, they're a reflection of who we've been, our towering successes, our failures, and our aspirations. And by deciding what we want to preserve, like Minidoka, they're also a reflection of who we are and who we want to be. And Minidoka takes its place alongside all those icons in the National Park Service. And the creation of a national park is really an expression of faith in the future. And I like to think, going back to that quote that I started my program out with from the editor of The Irrigator, that faith in the future, that the government would recognize its mistake, and that we would be here, and some of you in the audience live long enough to see sites like Minidoka, like Manzanar, other sites that are part of this story that are not owned by the National Park Service, to have that faith in the future and be able to preserve and protect those and help educate others about the importance of these sites to all of us. It's all of our history, our national story. And I'm just thankful to be here tonight, to be able to share a little bit about the park with you, and to be able to, working with the wonderful staff and partners, help move Minidoka into the future and really establish this site for all of you to come visit as soon as possible. Thank you. And I know I've kept everyone a little bit longer. I apologize for that. Take it off.
It is getting. You can take a couple of questions if there are any, but we won't extend this much longer. We did have more introductions than we usually would, so.
Wonderful.
There's a question right at the back.
I wonder if you could tell me something about the camp photographs that you showed, or the photographers. Were they all War Relocation Authority, or were there other sources? Do you know?
They were primarily government photos. Some of the few images that you see that were not taken by the government, many were from Manzanar and Ansel Adams, as I'm sure you've heard of, was allowed inside Manzanar and took many photographs. For many camps, and I'm not sure of the specifics from Minidoka, but at many camps, internees were not allowed to have cameras. They were not allowed to take pictures. There are some that were taken in a stealth fashion that we have today. But the number of images that we have here, many are in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., the Bancroft Library in Berkeley. But when you look at, I didn't show many pictures inside barrack buildings. In our research and talking with former internees, many of those were staged to make the camp look as good as it could and make the experience seem not so bad for the wider public and for society. So most of these images are official government images that you've seen. Yes, sir.
What is the cost of this? And is it all taxpayer money, or is there? That's one question I have. The other is, what is the transportation to it? It seems kind of like it's difficult to get there.
Mm-hmm. It's a place, it's a destination that you want to go to. We do not have signs right now along the interstate, which takes you through southern Idaho to Boise, which is the state capital. One of the issues right now when I arrived at the park is we have some just safety issues that we have barbed wire. Our students and Professor Newt can attest to that. Pieces of wood lying around on the ground, poles, so that the site itself is not safe and welcoming. And we actually, I'm proud to say, received some Economic Recovery Act, the legislation that President Obama signed recently, for some of those basic safety and maintenance needs to take care of those at the park. Taxpayer money, we do have a small budget. As I mentioned, when parks are established, they often don't have all the money they need to hire staff and take care of capital development. But we have wonderful partners such as the Friends of Minidoka and the Conservation Fund, who also bring resources so that we can develop projects and complete them for the park as well. Any other questions?
I'm interested in the element that's Bainbridge Island.
Mm-hmm.
That is new. I hadn't heard about that. Do you know if there's going to be other locations, other remote locations in Oregon or Alaska or something that would also tie into the
Not to my knowledge. Bainbridge, from what I understand from the folks who've long been involved in that project, there was some thought in the past that would be a separate unit of the National Park Service. And then that idea evolved to actually have that become a unit of the Minidoka National Historic Site. And we also have a cooperative agreement between the partners at Bainbridge Island as well as our sister park Manzanar in Southern California. So we share resources, we strategize about interpretation, education, what stories are best to tell at what sites. And it's really an exciting opportunity for us because both Manzanar and Minidoka are very remote. It's not an easy place to get to. And the number of visitors that we can reach will just be tripled, if not more so, with Bainbridge Island, because having that gateway in an urban area like Seattle, and that site can really serve as a gateway to the entire internment story, not just Minidoka or Manzanar, but be able to reach large numbers of visitors and share the whole story and talk about all of the camps. So we're really excited to be able to have that as part of the Park Service now. That answer your question? Yes, ma'am.
I think some of the other sites have been declared National Historic Sites. Are there any plans to develop those, like Park Mountain?
I'm not sure. The one, I'm glad you brought that up. The one new site that's in addition to the National Park Service is Tule Lake, the segregation center. There was legislation that was just passed before President Bush left office, and it created a new umbrella park. The title, World War II, Valor in World War II, I apologize, I can never quite remember it all. But it includes Tule Lake, it includes one of my former parks, the USS Arizona Memorial at Pearl Harbor, and some other sites under one umbrella site. Some of the other sites I know are on the National Register of Historic Places. They're not official units of the National Park Service. So we don't have any other plans right now to add more sites to the National Park Service that I'm aware of.
Thank you
once again.
I'd like to extend our thanks to Wendy for bringing this series to a close, and to those who've been to the previous ones. Thank you, and I think it was an appropriate way to, with the Yamauchi family's presence and Wendy talking about the future, is an appropriate way to bring this series to a close. So thank you very much, Wendy.